Wessel.
I like it. I like that German pronunciation, but it's just Wessel.
And
So strong.
you are a 2011.5 graduate of Middlebury College.
That's right. Spot on.
So
Go Sebs.
that's over 10 years ago now.
Way to make me feel old, man.
But that's one of the things is you stay and the little bit of about your work I've discovered and seen you're very active on Twitter, great Twitter presence, really lovely voice, personality, good sense of humor along with the information that you're sharing out there. And a big passion of yours is getting first time voters, young voters, people who are just entering the voting scene to empower them. Talk a little bit about that work and what brought you to doing that.
Yeah, totally. I spent a lot of time as a student at Middlebury and even beforehand, sort of as a youth activist. I was a rabble rouser in the streets. I was a rabble rouser, chaining myself to things. But I was also sort of a rabble rouser inside boring boardrooms. I grew up watching C-SPAN. I grew up inside the Beltway being like a real policy nerd. And the marriage of those two things, right? The ability to influence who's in charge, both by showing them how smart you are and the power of sort of your policy chops, mixed with the power of activism and that excitement and that enthusiasm that comes from being a part of a protest or a march or a rally. Really, those two things got married for me when I started working on election campaigns. So, like, my first opportunity to do that was really while I was a Middlebury student. I was in uh, several poli sci classes that felt very abstract and not very real, where the rubber meets the road. And so, me and six other Middlebury students actually created a campaign around the 2010 Vermont gubernatorial primary election, about as obscure as you can get. Um, and we had a theory of the case, which was there were five Democrats running in the primary, and clean energy was going to be on the ballot, depending on which of these people won. And so we wanted to register and get as many young people out to vote as possible in Vermont, in that primary. And turns out we were pretty good at it, and we really liked it. We helped elect a candidate who was pretty good on clean energy. It was the former governor, Peter Shumlin. Um, and I was hooked. I got the bug. What an easy way to build power, by talking to a bunch of your friends and convincing them that they hold the keys to change. It doesn't stand with some person in a windowless boardroom or inside the state capitol. It's actually us that have the power. So I spent the last decade flexing that muscle over and over.
And that goes right to some of this, like Greta Thunberg, like her work, like really the climate strikes and every Friday taking off school. It's
Mm.
that new focus on that young people who are just coming into themselves, their own identities, can really have an influence. Were you like surprised that you actually were get the stuff done that you want to do? Like, wow, that did you look around at each other on election night and be like, we did it?
Well, I wouldn't say that we're in a world right now that feels like we did all the things we need to accomplish. There's a lot, and we'll talk about COP. I'm sure there's a
Yeah.
lot of fights left to fight and a lot of work left to be worked on. But what I will say about the current moment where sort of youth activism is we have this great moral leadership coming from young people, whether it's folks like Greta or if it's the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, dreamers here in this country fighting for citizenship, indigenous organizers who are working to stop fossil fuel infrastructure like the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's this great moral argument to be made, which is you can't make decisions for young people and for our future without young people and without our input. And that moral argument has been a super fun thing to be a part of, frankly. And it's a long tradition in American politics, right? What I think is different about this moment is we're coupling that moral righteousness and lack of fear that I think is super associated with youth, with a demographic shift and a participation shift, where we are seeing Gen Z and millennials as the largest, most progressive, most diverse generations that have ever aged into the American electorate. And they're starting to show up in numbers that sort of are representative of our size, right? We're seeing in the 2020 election, for example, and this, a lot of students at Middlebury were a part of making this happen. We saw college students vote at the same rates as older Americans in the election. For the first time ever, we're reaching parity where young people are showing up in the same way that older folks are showing up. And that will lead to a sea change in our politics. So, like, I think that the progress is slow. Like, the moral arguments have always worked, and we've done some good things. You know, we've stopped pipelines, we've shut down coal plants, we've brought corporate boardrooms to their knees. And politics is maybe the lagging indicator on that, where that youth has to age into the electorate in order to really have that incredible, powerful transformation that I think we all know that we need to solve the climate crisis and all the sorts of other issues that we're fighting.
I want to ask one little question, made me think of what you just said before we get into COP and talk about the conference and what it's like to be there,
Sure.
because you've been to a couple yourself. How do you go into a group of young people, they may be a different ethnicity, different nationality from you, and say, I'm not a white savior. I'm not here to teach you how to, follow my lead, but to really collaborate and listen to those voices. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, as like a uh, uh, privileged white dude who grew up inside DC and went to fancy schools like Sidwell and Middlebury, I'm led into a lot of rooms that a lot of my peers aren't led into, right? People who have power currently know how to deal with me. They're like, oh, you're like a chubby Jewish guy. I know a lot of chubby Jewish guys. Let's hang out. And so what I've tried to do is exercise my unique power in those rooms to unlock resources, to get people to commit to funding things, to get the press to show up places, to get politicians to come meet with folks, and then be that conduit for folks who are on the front line, um, to actually make the more compelling arguments that I'm pretty bad at making. To be completely frank, I view my role as a connector and as a someone who will sort of unlock those halls of privilege and power to folks who aren't invited to the room. Um, and I think sometimes it works. Sometimes I'm pretty bad at it. You know, it's all a learning curve. I think the thing that's really interesting is the folks that we most need to persuade on climate issues, and especially policymakers and sort of corporate CEOs, are folks that are used to certain things. They're used to dealing with sort of wealthier people. They're used to dealing with whiter rooms, and we'd be stupid not to acknowledge that. If we think that we're going to change some of these folks' tendencies overnight, um, I think we'll lose or we'll win slower. And winning slowly on climate is a loss.
That's very true, especially seeing all of the reporting and stuff coming out. And the people that I've talked with for this series have said, like, we're out of runway. There's no more time.
Yeah,
Like, with this is, if we
totally.
if we don't come together as a humanity and as a planet now, there won't be a planet for humans that we can survive on in 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years from now. So let's talk
Totally.
about COP. You went to COP a couple of times in Poland and Copenhagen. If the work that you did at the COPs you've gone to worked, we wouldn't have one now.
Yes, sir.
What?
Thanks. It's always good to be reminded of my failures
Well,
in other
you're
settings.
trying.
Appreciate it.
It's the never giving upness that I was excited to talk to you about. What was the first one that you went to? Was that in Poland?
Yes. So the first COP I went to was in December 2008 in Poznan, Poland, a gray, dark, very Eastern European industrial city famous for its coal-fired power plants. A delightful place for a young budding activist vegetarian to not be able to eat anything. But I will say, I I went just to tell you a little bit more about the context under which I went. I went with a group of young activists from the US as part of an organization called Sustain Us, which I know several Middlebury alums have been a part of as well. And the theory behind the case of Sustain Us was we are actually the future policymakers of tomorrow. We are wonky, nerdy people. We want to show up in these negotiations and speak the language that the UN negotiators and the congressional delegations and all the fancy people who show up, we want to speak their language and be able to win arguments on our own merits about, oh no, this policy change should look like X instead of Y. And in 2009, was, as I was mentioning to you earlier, it was the last, or 2008, pardon, it was the last time George W. Bush's negotiators were being sent to COP. So we knew that the American delegation was not going to be constructive actors. And so the sustainist theory of the case was like, well, actually, young people just overwhelmingly elected Barack Obama. He's about to start. We're the real American negotiating team, and y'all should be talking to us. Like talking to these old Republicans is pretty dumb. We're the future, and we're the ones you should negotiate with. Um, yeah, that didn't really work. Suits and ties we put on, there was not a real. We weren't taken seriously by people that we wanted to be taken seriously by, and so it was a real learning curve for me to learn, hey, maybe I don't have to pretend I'm something I'm not. Maybe I don't have to pretend to be an older, stodgier, more wonky person than I really am. Instead, maybe it's more compelling to just be myself and try and recognize the power that I do have by being youthy and fiery and goofy and weird. Um, and that's the energy that I brought to COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. The Obama folks were in charge. We thought they were going to do better than they did. Um, but my tactics personally at that COP were to have more fun and be weirder and get more attention to the idea that young people weren't going to let negotiators negotiate away our future. And man, was that way better. So we, along with the sort of international youth climate movement, did so many weird direct actions and protesty media stunts to refocus the debate on what was actually at stake rather than incremental progress that was supposedly being made between the US and India or the US and the EU or whatever. And the biggest sort of stunty thing that we did that I think was actually had a lot more substance and meaning than I really even knew at the time was we brought 50 American young people and 50 Chinese young people together and had our own negotiating session and aligned on a policy vision for our future between the US and China that was science based, realistic, and also like concessions on both sides. And we were able to hold that up and show the US government delegation, the Chinese government delegation, like, we did it. How come y'all can't? And it was really cool. And we got a lot of good publicity and it was I think really effective at recognizing, showing policymakers that activists aren't just stunty people who like to wear costumes, but it's also substantive folks who can kick some tail. And frankly, just to close out, sorry, I know I talked a lot right now, but like it's pretty brave of some of those Chinese young people to tell their government that what they were doing was wrong. And I don't think I would have been as brave as they were. It was easy for me to yell at Obama people, and it was very hard for them, I think, to do some of what they were doing. And I was really excited to be a part of that.
That speaks a lot to the recognized importance of putting your, frankly, life and your family's well-being on the line for something that you really believe is important for your nation.
Totally.
Sounds like the first time you
It was
approached it
cool.
was three people in a trench coat trying to be grown up and get into the bar, and the next time was like you just got to be yourself and you can get in the room.
Yeah. I mean, let's be clear. We spent plenty of time in the bar.
So as
I
these
think that's right.
as this conversation goes, the Paris Climate Accord and then backing out of the Paris Climate Agreement is, how do you stay positive about these slow fits and starts moving forward?
Sure. Well, I will. I mean, on a very non-substantive note, the two COPs that I went to were both in Northern Europe, where it was dark and cold and gray in November and December, and then they started hosting these conferences in Cancun and Casablanca and Paris. And I was like, man, it's a lot more easy to be positive when you're in those places. So I feel for everyone who's in Glasgow right now, which I'm sure is dank and dark and damp. Um, I will say the positivity comes from the actual progress that's happening back home in these countries as we move forward. You know, the UN is not a There's never a real binding treaty that comes out of the UN. If you break some sneaky UN law, your country doesn't go to, country jail. And so what the international climate accords really are is a compendium of individual countries making national commitments that are using the force of law back home in their own countries. And every year, more and more countries show up to COP by saying, hey, here's the law that we passed at home, strengthening, going beyond what we said we would do. And it started out with countries inside the EU, Norway, Germany, places that were doing good work because they're always the first actors. Then we started getting some of the Asian countries, Japan, Indonesia, starting to have policy change that really started to make sense. And so when you get countries like the US or Brazil or Russia who are reverting on their previous commitments based on the political winds of what's going on at home, it's not done in a vacuum. There are people taking steps forward while others are taking steps backward. The interesting thing about Paris and everything post Paris was all the low hanging fruit was done. All of the happy-go-lucky countries that have no problem switching to clean energy, they'd already basically said we're going to do what we're going to do. And so because I'm a total optimist, every commitment that's come post Paris is a way tougher commitment to make. And so when we see things like we've seen this week, where India has announced they're going to set a goal of being net neutral on their emissions by 2070, that's a tough ask to make of a country like India. And the fact that they're making that commitment gives me that hope and that positivity that I think is needed to try and get those folks over the finish line. What I don't think is smart is saying, wow, this one bad thing happened, so everything is bad forever, which has tended to be how a lot of UN negotiators feel when they leave COP. And perhaps is why I no longer go to COP.
Thank you for taking some time today. I've got just one more question for you, and I think this taps right into the work that you do. If I want to make a difference in the world around me, what's the best thing that I could do?
Yeah.
Write a letter to the newspaper, go to my city council or select board meeting? How can I be an effective activist on my own?
Yeah, I love and hate this question. I love it because everybody does have agency in their own world. I hate it because there's not one answer that works for everyone. So what I challenge everyone to do, whether it's a young person that I'm working with who's organizing their campus, or it's a grandmother who's worried about leaving their kids with a terrible planet on which to live, I say, where do you have unique leverage? What are the rooms in which you are powerful? And then exercise as much of that power as possible. So maybe for you, that you can get the Middlebury College Communications Office to commit to only publishing stories about alums who are doing positive things in clean energy and ignoring all the other stuff because it will focus our attention on that. For other folks, it may be, oh, the city councilor is my neighbor and I can go over and have beers with them and put some of my own social capital on the line and say, hey, look, I know you're focused on other things, but this is what the most important thing that you should focus on. Or maybe it's talking, I'm a partisan actor. Maybe it's talking about if you're a Democrat, going out and talking to your Republican family members or friends or community members and say, hey, look, here's why I think what you're saying is right. And here's what I would like to see you change, and have those uncomfortable conversations. It's never as simple as plant a tree, write a letter. It's always about putting something on the line for yourself. The thing that makes you feel uncomfortable probably makes you feel uncomfortable because it's the most important thing to do. So that's what I'd encourage people to do. And boy, is that real. I don't know if most Twitch streaming is very colorful language, but that's some real, it sucks to have to do hard stuff, but it's worth it because we don't have another choice.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm going to stop our Twitch
Yeah,
stream. We'll chat on Discord for just a couple more minutes. Thank you very, very much for taking some time today.
of course, always.